Viewers, day 9 of the Russian invasion has brought the world to the edge of their seats. The day dawned with news of a Russian raid on Europe's largest nuclear plant. Ominous videos of a missile making its way and erupting in a ball of fire sent chills down the spine. Loud explosions continued for many minutes. The Ukrainians rang the nuclear alarm, raising the specter of a Chernobyl rerun. Firemen rushed to douse the flames as Russia fired missiles to deter them. For a while, it appeared that the reactor core would be hit and the world would be faced with nuclear Armageddon. Luckily, that didn't happen. The reactor is safe, and there is no spike in radiation at the plant. Fate intervened, and the Russians called off their strike, aimed at clearing a way for them to take over the plant, which they have done. After Chernobyl, the Zaporizhzhia plant is the second nuclear facility in Russian hands. Here's a report, viewers.
After the fall of Chernobyl, now the area near the largest nuclear plant in Europe, Zaporizhzhia, has come under heavy shelling. While tanks did not reach the nuclear plant, the rain of bullets and shells has made the threat of an impending nuclear disaster very real.
Увага! Техніка Російської Федерації веде вогонь по Запорізькій атомній електростанції. Існує реальна загроза ядерної небезпеки на найбільшій атомній електростанції Європи. Вимагаємо припинити вогонь з тяжкої техніки по енергоблокам Запорізької АЕС. Повторюю, припинити вогонь з тяжкої техніки по Запорізькій АЕС.
Remember 1986? Remember Chernobyl? A nuclear reactor exploded, spreading radioactive radiation across Europe. Some estimates say over 16,000 lives were lost. Roughly 5 trillion rupees were spent to clear the radiation over the years. Today, we stare at a similar disaster. If the fire spreads to the reactors or even the cooling system.
Якщо буде вибух, це кінець всім, кінець Європи, це евакуація Європи. Тільки негайні дії Європи можуть зупинити російські війська. Не допустіть загибелі Європи від катастрофи на атомній станції.
Worldwide alarm and condemnation came in quick and fast.
You mentioned the reports of active shelling of nuclear sites in Ukraine. That just seems to me to absolutely reinforce the complete breach of any aspects of international law and all aspects of international law that apply here, of the UN Charter.
With the horrifying sounds of war echoing over the nuclear power plant, today the fears of the Chernobyl rerun are real. The question is, will Putin cross the nuclear line?
Viewers, Putin's disregard even for nuclear red lines begs the question, is the West at a loss to stop Putin? Let's open this out to our guests. I'm delighted, first and above all, to welcome back Mr. McAdams on popular demand. I'm sure you are aware, Mr. McAdams, that you've become somewhat of an instant cult figure here in India, and for many hours you were the top trend across the nation. The more impressionable in my country have even changed their Twitter display pictures to your image in homage. This is a Je suis McAdams moment for them. Not bad for a man who didn't even get to speak a word. In a sense, Mr. McAdams, you've come very close to emulating a certain legend who moved the nation without speaking a word, sometimes for days at an end. So there is power in silence. And I'm learning that. for the opportunity, of course, of bringing some joy in these grim times to the world. I and my most contrite show producer are thankful to you. Indeed, what would we be without you, Mr. McAdams, today? I am hearing from a section of Indians most upset at the state of Indian journalists that they are intending to set up the McAdams School of Journalism. While many of us are in need of reform, don't, however, and this is my advice to you, contribute any funds to it, because some invested in this endeavor have been known to misappropriate donations. But I promise not to stand in your way tonight, and so begin by asking you, yes, Mr. McAdams, well and truly you, my first question. What's made Putin show such little regard for nuclear red lines, and has the West lost the capacity to stop him?
Well, I'm going to take a couple of chill pills before I answer that. But this is a war, and this is a war that's progressed very, very quickly for the past week. Remember, the United States bombed Serbia for 78 days, and it took 3 weeks for the United States to take Baghdad, which is not Ukraine, by the way. So this war takes a long time. There was fighting around the nuclear power plant. As I understand it, that's been secured by the Russians. Most of the Ukrainian army is encircled at the moment. They've lost all ability to maneuver. It's all over, in my opinion, but for the agreement. And I hope that agreement comes soon, because a lot of innocent people will die if Ukraine continues to refuse to make an agreement that's already in the books. It's already going to happen.
So Daniel McAdams, correct me if I'm wrong. What you're suggesting is that Russia must get its way now to prevent death on a catastrophic scale. Is that what you're saying?
No, listen, this is not a football game. This is reality. Ukraine was never going to join NATO. That was never on the table. That's not anything they would ever have. This is a cynical ploy by the United States, which, let's not forget, overthrew the government in Ukraine in 2014, overthrew an elected government and put its own proxy in power next door to Russia. Ukraine was never eligible for NATO membership anyway, and this event is the exact reason why Ukraine should never have gone into NATO. Thank God it's not, because NATO would have been obligated to start World War III. So the fact that Ukraine was never going to go into NATO in the first place, and even if it won, it wouldn't go into NATO, then what is the point now of continuing to fight? What is wrong with neutrality? It served Switzerland, Finland, and Austria and other countries very, very well for a long time, and we're going back to status quo ante.
So let me get this right, Daniel McAdams, before I bring in Elbridge Colby, author and ex-Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. Mr. McAdams, are you suggesting that Biden blundered and has pushed Ukraine into the line of Russian fire, and now we've got a horrible situation on our hands where, for some bizarre geopolitical grandstanding, we have got scapegoats?
I think you have to go back the past 30 years in the post-Cold War era and see that the United States foreign policy has blundered, and it hasn't served the American people well. It's very pro-America to say that our foreign policy is not serving us very well. You have a series of wars. It's very interesting. The first day of fighting in Ukraine, look what happened to American military manufacturing stocks. They went through the roof. This war is being fought for special interests, the oil and gas sector, the military sector. But for the past 30 years, the U.S. has a series of foreign interventions that have left the countries at the receiving end of these interventions in disastrous states. Look, you can't criticize what's happening now without thinking about Raqqa in Syria, which was leveled and everyone killed. So we need to get to a U.S. foreign policy of non-interventionism. That means stop overthrowing governments, because you have unintended consequences like we're seeing today. Actions have consequences, and we're seeing the consequences. That's not to excuse the fighting that's going on. That's not to cheer Russia. That's not to cheer war. War is terrible. It should never have happened. But if someone punches you in the face and you attack them with a knife, you're guilty, but you have to ask, why did they punch you in the face in the first place?
Mr. Colby, would you like to respond?
on your show, and I mean, I don't think this is about the United States invading any other countries or changing their government. This is about Russia invading a sovereign country that wants to be secure and independent and free, and is standing up for its autonomy very nobly and bravely. And I don't want to be flippant about it, but I think we all can see what's happening here, and it's not our fault. I mean, I am the first to say, and I've said repeatedly publicly, the U.S. foreign policy has gotten fundamentally misguided over the last generation, but we should not be confused here. The Russians are the ones who initiated this aggression and are, shelling a nuclear power plant. I mean, so let's just be clear on the issue here, which is that, Russia is at fault. And I think, the whole world community, I assume in India as well, would prefer this war to end, of course. But we should support Ukraine's, ability and willingness to stand up for its independence. I think that's, in a sense, what your previous guest was saying, is that countries want to stand up for their freedom and so forth. And so why shouldn't we apply that logic right now as well?
Well, I don't know, but let me just ask you, Mr. Colby, as a follow-up. This argument of yours suits you well in the West because it allows you to wash your hands off Ukraine and where it finds itself today. That's what many people are saying. And today you're also finding, or at least wanting to find people and countries like India, for example, and hector them into taking positions which might actually undermine their security interests because you've realized that you've blundered, you've pushed a country of several million people into the jaws of death. That's what, in essence, a lot of people are saying.
Well, look, I think our policy has clearly been mistaken. Don't get me wrong. I don't speak for the U.S. government at this point. I'm speaking for myself. I don't think U.S. policy has been successful. I think that it has been ill-advised, and I think we need to move towards an overarching policy that is more realistic in nature and looks at countries' particular interests. So I'm not in favor of, filleting or haranguing India to try to fully align India, say, with the position of a Poland. I think India faces particular security concerns. The same is true with Israel. India faces China and Pakistan. That's more than enough. And the U.S. should align our interests wherever possible with those of our partners. And I think the U.S.-India partnership is extremely important. Along with Japan, probably it's the most important partnership the United States will have going forward because China is the top priority and the top threat to U.S. and interests and India's interests, according to the Indian.
But as of now, of course, the Americans are very distracted because
they are. That's very worrying.
And that is very worrying, absolutely. So, Mr. Colby, okay, so let me just open this up further and bring in General Bakshi, Maruf Raza, and Derek Grossman, Senior Defense Analyst of the RAND Corporation. General Bakshi, we have a situation where Putin has got Ukraine by the scruff of its collar or its neck, and the world can do very little. And the onus now, if one were to take what Mr. McAdams is saying on board, is on now Ukraine to say, okay, well, we lay down arms, we'll end this war. Okay, we've got an audio issue. Maruf, would you like to take that question? We've got an audio issue with General. Yes. Maruf.
Rahul, there have been very interesting comments by our two guests earlier. I just want to take this further by making the following points. Point one, the issue about India's neutrality, which seems to be worrying a lot of people in the West, and especially Western capitals, is strange because it doesn't worry them when countries in Europe have taken all along a neutral stance on a number of things, and actually the view that is being championed that if some countries like Switzerland, Austria and whoever else could remain neutral and Ukraine could have been allowed to remain neutral, then why is Ukraine being asked to take sides? Likewise, there is a view in India that if this is a European conflict, then why is India being asked to take sides? We've got our own strategic interests. Second point, the American intelligence agencies, like they often do, have got it horribly wrong about what the Russians would have been wanting to do, what the Russian strategic aims were and agenda. Likewise, the Russians have also got it wrong in terms of their expectations of how this conflict would unfold. But a couple of things that any military analyst would see it clearly written on the wall. You know, when you go in for attack, you either expect that you walk in with weapons and the other side buckles down, or you expect a showdown. If it's going to be a showdown, you need a minimum of 3-1 superiority, if not 5-1 or 10-1 when you're fighting in built-up areas. Russia has put in, apparently by Western accounts, about 150,000 plus minus soldiers into this entire operation, though they are not being pushed into areas where there is heavy fighting in bulk. That means 150,000 not going towards Kyiv, or 150,000 not going towards Kharkiv or wherever else, but they're spread out. Whereas the Ukrainians, if you see the total number of people who have been known to be under arms and have received training or weapons, is in excess of 370,000. So therefore, if the Ukrainian army was 170,000, plus reservists were another 100,000, plus volunteers, territorial army, and whatever else US Special Forces have trained, it adds up to 370,000. I'm quoting figures from the New York Times. So therefore, the Russians are actually fighting a force twice their size with heavy weaponry, which sooner or later will be put into play when frustration leads to more and more Russian troops throwing up their hands, or desertions, or casualties, or whatever else. Now, what do you expect to come out of it? I just wish some of our American experts will give us a little enlightenment on 2-3 points. One is, after withdrawing from Afghanistan, America had spelt out its new policy, which was essentially no boots on the ground in a battlefield, but over-the-horizon operation. What does it mean? Logically, it means use of air power. Okay. If America and their friends could use air power in Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and their forces were involved, whether they were hit or not, was not seen as an act of war against NATO, why is this fig leaf being taken by the NATO to say, oh, if NATO gets involved, this would be a world war? If NATO gets involved, when a NATO country is physically trampled upon by Russians, if NATO gets involved by providing firepower, NATO is already involved, money, firepower, sanctions, true, and so many other things like, you know, disguised men operating there as reservists or whatever else. So what is the harm if American firepower comes in to stall the Russians wherever they are? Then the Ukrainians, their resistance would have been worth it. Otherwise, sooner or later, they'll get walked over, because the Russians can be very ruthless, as General Bakshi will ascertain what I'm saying, in their battle against the Chechens in Grozny and in Georgia and even in Crimea. So that's the first question. What is over-the-horizon operations now? Why
let's break this down. Maruf, let's break this down, because we've got other panelists. So let's break this down. Let's break this down. We will take it step by step. I want to bring in General Bakshi and Derek Grossman. Derek Grossman, coming to you first. Has the time come for Mr. Zelensky to put down his weapons and accept, perhaps, the reality that he's got played here?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I would disagree with that. I mean, I think now is more than ever the time to continue the fight, because, you know, frankly, they don't have any choice but to survive in this situation. Now, that said, you can copy what apparently President Putin is doing, which is continue to fight and negotiate at the same time to improve your position for negotiations later down the line. So I reject the idea that Zelensky should just put down his arms and, you know, do what the Russians say, because that is not in line with maintaining a sovereign state. Which is, Ukraine is a sovereign state, contrary to what President Putin said, you know, prior to this invasion, and it would really undermine the rules-based international order to see a sovereign state, you know, decide to bow down to the Russians. There is no reason for that. And I guess the problem that I've had on the India side, and again, completely understanding India's non-aligned policy and strategic autonomy, the U.S. and India are also becoming pretty good friends, mostly due to China, but for other reasons as well. And at the beginning of your show, you showed several different, statements from foreign leaders who seem like they've had enough of Putin's aggression, especially now firing upon a nuclear facility in Ukraine. So my question, respectfully, to all the Indians watching and to India itself is, when have you guys had enough of this? I mean, when will you say firing upon a nuclear facility has gone too far, and that we need to, decide to support the U.S., NATO, and the allies against Russia?
It's an important question.
More Russian aggression.
Very important question, and I'm going to bring in General Bakshi, but I want to step in here for 30 seconds. India was warning the West of the threat of Pakistan-based terror.
I can't hear.
India was warning the West of the threat of Pakistan-based terror for 25 years. 25 years. But the West, led by the United States, played the great game in a way where India was losing tens and thousands of its soldiers and citizens to Pakistan-backed insurgencies in Punjab, in Kashmir. When did Washington stand up and say that they've had enough and cut their ties to the apron strings of a series of Pakistani dictators? Only when the trade towers came down, only when the Pentagon was hit. So let's not be too preachy, Mr. Grossman. I'm sorry to say, you treat Latin America and the Caribbean as your sphere of influence. You almost sparked a nuclear war in the 60s by intervening in Cuba seeking regime change. You, as in the United States, also went on full tilt, Mr. Grossman, to topple regimes in Latin America that were not friendly to you. And you treated that as your sphere of influence. Russia has concerns. I am not for a moment justifying Russian aggression. Lives are being lost. But you've thrown a lot of Ukrainian lives under the bus, the West has. And I want to bring in General Bakshi.
Well, okay, but you mentioned me by name. May I respond,
yeah, of course.
Respectfully?
Go ahead.
So you did this last time on Monday when I appeared on the show.
Go ahead.
You started out
Mr. Grossman. Go
10
ahead.
minutes with a litany of past transgressions that the U.S. has done against India. And frankly, it's whataboutism. I mean, it's history, and we need to think about today and going forward.
Right.
Okay, so that I think is what should be at the top of our minds, not trying to relitigate what the U.S. has done, around the world, contrary to Indian and other interests.
So, fire. Biden lights the fire, and India has to run around with the hose to douse it. Interesting. I mean, look, it's a point of view, and it's a great one. Let me bring in General Bakshi on this. General Bakshi. General Bakshi, can you hear me? Why can't we hear General Bakshi? We can't hear General Bakshi. Can we hear General Bakshi? Can the director tell me?
Can
yes,
you hear
no.
me, please?
Yes, we can hear General Bakshi. Go ahead, General Bakshi. Great. Yes, we can hear you, sir. We can hear you. Go ahead.
All right. Rahul, the Russian perspective is wholly missing from this entire discourse. The Russians are saying that there were 6 biological warfare facilities that the U.S. State Department of Defense had established in Ukraine, all right? One of them was established by DARPA, which was working on bad
corona viruses. Let's get a handle on this.
Russia has lost about 6 lakh people.
And taking the cover of this, bad coronaviruses were being shoved from this side also. That is where they used the thermobaric weapon, all right, because they wanted to fry up the viruses. 6 of these facilities were active in Ukraine. This is biological terrorism of the worst kind. The Russians are saying they have intelligence to the effect that fissile material from Ukraine plants has been diverted towards weaponization. They have sold some of it, the rest is going for weaponization. That is why they say they are going to secure all the plants, because just like, America helped or looked the other way when Pakistan went nuclear, because, you know, they didn't want Russians to clobber it during the Afghan intervention. They looked the other way. Were they looking the other way? You know, the Russians are obsessively secretive. That doesn't help them in the information war. But now they are saying they have more of an excuse to intervene than the US had in Iraq with those fabricated nuclear weapon threat. Here is an actual threat, they are saying. 6 biological warfare laboratories. When you make your country a bridgehead for attacking another country, well, you should be prepared to take what comes. And the Americans and the NATO, I think it's a highly immoral position, have left these poor Ukrainians high and dry.
Okay.
They are saying we won't come. So the Russians say we will take our time clobbering these people. You know, as Mearsheimer, I respect him a lot, an American which my Rand Corporation friend would know. Mearsheimer has said the Russian aim is to wreck Ukraine as a cohesive state, so that it cannot pose a threat anymore. It cannot rent out its territory a la Pakistan for all kind of nefarious activities against Russia. And if you go by what CNN is saying and BBC is saying, it seems to be as if Ukraine has won the war and there's going to be a coup in Moscow tomorrow. You know, if there is a war between India and Pakistan and Indian tanks reach Islamabad, would you call it a victory for Pakistan? I mean, give us a break. This is insufficiently contextual. This is highly exaggerated. This is pure information warfare at the cost of facts. You see, we have to base our calculations on what is happening on ground.
General, I agree with you. I don't have, of course, the facts
warfare
of
narratives.
To confirm the first 2 claims you made on behalf of the Russians, and I know that we don't have a Russian interlocutor on this panel, so we lack that, but we have with us...
I can give you the data.
Yeah, well, I accept that, but again, you know, I mean, it's not verified by me or by the channel first. So, look, I respect your scholarship and I respect your research, etc., but those 2 remarks I can't endorse, but the rest of what you're saying makes perfect sense. Maruf Raza, to what Mr. Grossman was saying about India's role and how India should be doing some more of the heavy lifting, so to speak.
Well, Rahul, you know, they are conveniently using this as an event in our times and history to finally wean India away from Russia. But our dependence with Russia is enormous. It's not 60% of military platforms, but a recent study by SIPRI in Stockholm says that our dependence is about 85% of our platforms. The second thing is, many experts in India will agree with me when I say that Russia has given us strategic military platforms while America has continued to insist, sign on this dotted line and sign on that dotted line. So we want you to have complete connectivity with you and complete communications with you. The 3 foundation military agreements are a case in point before we can share more technology with you. Russia doesn't do all that insistence. Now let me also explain that where I'm coming from. I am not, I repeat, I am not endorsing the great amount of human abuses that are happening on the battlefield.
Yeah.
War is a nasty process, it's a nasty business. But just as much as the West says that why was Ukraine not allowed to be independent, then for God's sake, why did you not give an assurance to the Russians to say they will be independent, they will not be part of NATO? If that is an assurance that can evade war, then let's give it to you. But I am actually quite convinced that the American military-industrial complex, a term that President Eisenhower had expanded on in the 50s, is a complex that is looking for wars and ideally a winnable war. They make money out of conflicts. They made money out of the Gulf War I, Gulf War II. They made money out of a whole lot of other agencies which are quasi-military, like Blackwater, that went in and represented American troops on the ground in Iraq and wherever else. So there is a financial element to it. What is Russia's financial motivation? Ukraine is Europe's breadbasket. Ukraine has more mineral resources than many European countries put together. Uranium resources, iron ore, magnesium, titanium, and a whole lot of other things, rare earth materials that are required to make the technologies that even European airline industry desperately wants. So when the sanctions come into play, some of that will be denied to them, whether Ukraine and Russia combined. We import things also from Ukraine, but not at that size. So Russia's motivation plus is not just territorial control, is also control of a very, very economically vibrant region that is going to give a bit of a kick to the Russian economy upwards. Now, the final point, you know, whenever the West does something, it is kosher, it is all legally acceptable, and it is the right thing. As though they have God's own mandate to teach us all how civilized behavior should be conducted anywhere. And I'm not saying the Russians are civilized, but what I'm trying to say, that why are you continuing to corner India into taking a decision? We will take a decision in our interest. And has anybody in the West had the gumption to tell the Chinese that how about you taking sides? After all, you claim to preach about fair, balanced approach to international affairs. Why are you standing with Russia? They won't, because they have business interests with China. The entire sanctions are worked out in such a way that China doesn't get scratched. Yes, Russia will be penalized, but my assessment is, and I've spoken to a lot of experts, Russia will come out of it not looking too bad.
Okay, last word to General Bakshi, but before that, Mr. McAdams, where do you come in on this, the fact that India must take a side, and as if that will end the war?
Again, it's not a football game. You know, we're talking about serious business here. The United States has been involved in overthrowing the Ukrainian government twice. Don't forget that. Back in the Orange Revolution, and then again in 2014. So when you want to talk about a rules-based international order, it's a very convenient term for Americans to excuse them for doing things that hurt other people and that don't help America whatsoever. As we sit here talking right now, the United States has troops illegally in Syria stealing Syrian oil. The U.S. backed al-Qaeda in Syria to try to overthrow a secular government. So it's funny, the rules-based order only applies to every other country but the United States. We need to have a U.S. foreign policy that leaves other countries alone, doesn't overthrow their governments, doesn't bomb them, and allows them to seek their own destiny.
Daniel McAdams, I know now why you were trending at #1 yesterday. Let me bring in General Bakshi. Yes, General Bakshi, go ahead.
You know, Rahul, I totally endorse what Daniel has said. A 40-day air campaign preceded the US invasion of Iraq. 40 days air campaign. Mind you, the entire military infrastructure, apart from that, the entire communication infrastructure, bridges, roads, etc., everything was comprehensively destroyed before the Americans ground troops stepped foot in Iraq. And after that heavy dosage of TNT, you know, that blasts the will to fight of anyone. The Russians used to do that in World War II. They did it in Chechnya for a very curious reason, because they felt they were going to go in for former, you know, Soviet era relations. They held their hand. There was just a one-day air campaign for SEAD, suppression of air defenses, and confined only to that. It was quite inadequate in any military terms. When the Americans went into Yugoslavia, 78 days of bombing. Did I hear a moral squeak? Did I hear a moral squeak from anyone? You know, it is when the Americans wage war, the others are cockroaches. They are not humans. Well, but when the Russians wage war and they pull their punches, they have delayed this whole operation. Should have in our reckoning,
or when India liberated Bangladesh, or when India liberated Bangladesh, we were hectored.
13 days we had liberated Bangladesh.
Absolutely, but we had the Americans to contend with. They didn't like our intervention, which was a righteous one, viewers. At that time, they had a problem with us not being neutral. Very, very funny. Viewers, I leave it at this. It's been an engaging discussion. Mr. McAdams has enriched this discussion. I've let him speak. And we've had some interesting exchanges.